Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is George, and I'll be introducing our group presentation on sustainable transport. So the purpose of our group is to illustrate how the private and public transport sectors can evolve in order to ensure global decarbonisation and that climate targets are met. The transport sector is becoming one of the leading sources of emissions since progress to decarbonise has been slow compared to other sectors. Without a rapid transition to low-carbon technologies, the impacts of climate change, fossil fuel dependency, and local air pollution will be exacerbated. We therefore aim to present solutions via various strategies, technologies, and policies. A prime example of low-carbon transport is electric vehicles, or EVs. We therefore want to begin by looking at the topic of privately owned EV passenger vehicles. Maria will first present her case study work for EV uptake in Swindon, which highlights some of the grid-related issues associated with this transition. I will then propose a potential solution to this problem with my research on solar integrated vehicles. Alternatively, we also want to cover the electrification of publicly used transport, mainly focusing on taxis. This is because taxi systems are much more regulated, and therefore a transition can happen relatively quickly compared to privately owned vehicles. In addition, taxi electrification can bridge the knowledge gap between people and EV technology. Therefore, Phoebe will first present her work looking at taxi frameworks in 5 European cities. This will then be followed by Cameron's techno-economic study on electric motorcycle taxi fleets in Kenya and Rwanda. But we also want to provide a wider perspective on low-carbon vehicles. Therefore, Issue will provide insight into the overall policy of EVs by comparing the policy landscape of EVs in India to that of the UK and China. Since maritime transport also accounts for a significant portion of global transport emissions, Minan will then conclude with her study on the use of ammonia and hydrogen in the maritime sector. So I'm going to pass on to Maria now, who's going to kick things off.
Thank you, George. I will now present my project, which focused on understanding how the behavior of private electric vehicles directly impacts the local grid. This was done by applying a modeling framework to assess Swindon Borough's case, since a link was created with the local stakeholder. An initial objective of this study was to provide detailed guidelines for the future application of this methodology, and then it aimed to answer stakeholders' questions through assessing the daily EV load profiles, the average usage rates of charging ports, and the charging behavior. Finally, they aim to provide recommendations to the electric mobility future. For this study, NetLogo software was used to build an agent-based model, which in simple terms allows the simulation of agents' behavior within a set environment and space. Then, 3 entities can primarily be depicted. As Swindon Borough's geospatial layout is converted to grid cells, each one was considered to be fed by the closest primary substation and was described by the type of area it represented, such as commercial areas, car parks, schools, and so on. Then, the agents representing the local residents were characterized based on the social demographic parameters below, and their week-and-weekend activity schedules were generated based on the resulting profiles. The charging infrastructure and EV figures were described per substation and were based on forecasts compliant with net zero targets. Slow, fast, and rapid public charging ports were respectively distributed between commercial areas, car parks, and fuel stations. And then, the EV number was distributed between agents with similar characteristics to some that define early EV adopters in literature. For the charging rates and EV characteristics, they were mainly described in environment parameters. For the analysis, 2 scenarios were created, where on the first an unconstrained charging availability was presented, and on the second it was constrained between 5 and 8:30 p.m., since the highest national electricity demands are detected here. This study included a 3-year analysis to describe the decade evolution. Moving to the results, the total load profiles in dark blue and black showed that in 2020, scenario 2 was able to reduce overall average and peak loads, reaching up to 24% and 7% lower magnitudes, respectively. For the following years, increasingly higher loads were reached as EV penetration increased. Again, scenario 2 had a similar impact on the load profiles, except in 2030. Then, controlling the charging availability shaved off demand during constrained periods, displacing for later hours. However, from analysis, it was perceptible that the magnitudes of these delayed loads take high proportions of the daily peak over time, possibly matching it by 2036. Finally, from the following plots, this scenario showed to lower the average usage rates of charging ports by around 22%, and it also reduced the likelihood of stranded EVs, which are defined as agents that run out of charge due to not finding a charging port. Using Swindon Borough's case, it was possible to conclude that scenario 2 showed more beneficial results from the perspective of various entities. This scenario can then be implemented through electricity price signaling, where higher prices can be seen during higher demand and lower supply periods, and vice versa. From the network operator's side, the earlier the charging availability is controlled, the lower grid reinforcement is required, reducing the overall investment. However, delaying the demand should be done cautiously as to not create further grid constraints. In the case of the charging network infrastructures, infrastructure stakeholders, this scenario proved to reduce the required install capacity by 22%, also leading to a lower infrastructure investment. Then, it also resulted in less stranded EVs and lower demands, suggesting that it can aid EV owners to assess their real requirement to charge. Also, if price signaling is well implemented, it could further reduce charging expenses for the user. Finally, over the years, controlling the charge availability between 5 to 8:30 p.m. gradually became less effective in lowering the demand profile. Therefore, other periods reaching high charging loads, as seen from 7 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. in 2030, should be explored for additional control. Thank you. I'll now hand it back over to George.
Thank you very much, Maria. I'll now present my work on energy system modelling of vehicle-integrated solar photovoltaics in London. So the transport sector has recently become the leading source of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. And since London has such a high concentration of vehicles, it's become a key target for decarbonisation. Pretty soon, there'll also be a citywide ban on conventional fossil fuel vehicles, which has been brought forward to 2035. And so, therefore, a rapid transition to low-carbon vehicles, such as electric vehicles, is needed. However, there are some barriers to EV uptake. Unmanaged additional demand from vehicle charging often coincides with peak hours, which puts a strain on local grid networks. So therefore, charging optimization strategies need to be developed to shift this additional demand to off-peak hours. Adding to this, recent prototypes and studies have also shown strong potential for solar PV integrated EVs. Since the solar PV capacity reduces grid energy requirements, the key aim of this project is to quantify the amount of grid relief that can be provided by solar integration in addition to charging strategies. The methodology consists of two main steps: energy system modelling and grid charging optimization. For energy system modelling, the continuous lifetime optimization of variable electricity resources tool, or CLOVER for short, has been used. It simulates an energy system, which is an EV in this case, over hourly time steps using a series of inputs such as hourly energy consumption and solar power generation profiles. CLOVER then outputs a series of profiles, the key one here being the EV grid charging profile, since this is what we want to optimize. So far, I've completed simulations for 15 EVs, and for each one, 12 grid charging scenarios have been created, with each of these varying the amount of solar capacity and the state of charge at which charging events occur. Each grid charging profile is then input into 4 different charging optimization algorithms, where grid charging loads are shifted to off-peak hours via different methods. The following slide shows the grid charging profiles for a single vehicle over a year produced by the CLOVER simulations for increasing solar capacity. As you can see, as solar integration is increased, the number of charging events throughout the year is massively reduced. This is particularly true during the summer months, where the vehicle can effectively avoid grid charging for prolonged periods of time. Moving on to the optimization results. The graphs I'm about to show are an example of average daily EV plus household demand for both unoptimized and optimized grid charging profiles. In this case, for zero solar integration. As you can see, the additional peak demand from EVs has been shifted to off-peak early morning hours by this strategy. However, by shifting all of this demand to the morning, we're still able to see that EVs provide additional peak demand at this time. Alternatively, by introducing 2 kilowatts of peak solar capacity, this early morning peak in demand can be effectively avoided, meaning no extra power generation capacity is required. Overall, solar integration can give the driver independence from the grid and reduces their annual charging costs and grid energy demands. By defining grid relief as a reduction in daily peak demand, additional reductions provided by solar integration are determined by the efficiency of the charging strategy. In other words, if charging strategies are unable to avoid additional peak demand, solar integration can provide that additional grid relief to avoid extra generation capacity requirements. That's all from me. I'll be passing on to Phoebe.
Thank you, George. So my project explores the feasibility of taxi electrification in 5 European cities. The purpose is to develop a framework and perform a case study on the cities of Oslo, London, Paris, Athens, and Istanbul to determine the impact of the taxi fleet electrification. The main objectives are to estimate the e-taxi fleet sizes required to meet the demand, determine the use phase emission reductions and how this will economically impact local governments and taxi drivers, as well as identify the actions that should be taken to allow for a beneficial transformation. We examined 2 fleet renewal options. The first one replaces the existing fleet with the latest gasoline taxis, and the second option with electric ones. This diagram shows how the 2 fleets are created through the individual taxi and fleet generators and are then inputted into the different layers to examine the net impact of the e-taxi fleet compared to the conventional one. So now we can take a closer look into the 2 core models. In the individual taxi model, 2 drivers are randomly chosen, generating a taxi schedule that undergoes a series of conditions to determine the status of the taxi, which can be driving with or without a customer, being on a break, or charging in the case of e-taxis. For the conventional fleet, the model is run to generate the number of taxis in the existing fleet, and this process is repeated by adjusting the probability until the demand is met over a specified tolerance range. The same probability is then used in the electric taxi fleet generator, and the individual model runs until it outputs the required minimum and maximum number of e-taxis required. The scenarios examined include the baseline, where demand for conventional and e-taxis is equal, and 2 higher e-taxi demand scenarios. Larger e-taxi sizes are needed to satisfy the demand, and a range of additions is suggested. For the baseline scenario, here we can see the e-taxi fleet activity in the city of Paris and observe the charging peak generated since the charging behavior is unregulated. The time spent without customers on board results in low demand factors in all cities, indicating that the systems are inefficient. But as demand for e-taxis increases, the percentage of time spent with customers gets higher and the fleet becomes more utilized. The environmental impact results show that Oslo achieves the highest greenhouse gas reductions since it has a larger share of renewables in its electricity mix. E-taxis in all scenarios achieve 100% reductions for the NOx, VOC, and SOx air pollutants because e-taxis do not produce tailpipe emissions. But the negative reductions show that the e-taxi fleets do not reduce the PM emissions because they are larger in size, and the differences in the scenarios result from the random factor in the fleet generation algorithm. Now, for the economic impact to local governments, the large sizes of the fleets result in high charging demand peaks and more e-taxi benefits required. And the model creates a dispersed network leading to the most expensive cost scenario. In the baseline, e-taxi drivers in Athens experience a lower TCO compared to conventional ones because of the new electrification plan and the short trips and low taxi fares. All other cities require an increase in e-taxi demand to break even with conventional taxis due to the significant reduction in the revenue loss component. Finally, we observe that if the ownership period of e-taxis is increased to 10 years, they can economically benefit in certain cities. Based on the results that we discussed about, local governments should prioritize working towards a cleaner electricity sector to maximize the greenhouse gas reductions. Also, one suggestion is to provide incentives to taxi drivers to encourage charging during non-peak hours in order to avoid peaks and flatten the curve. Finally, it is recommended to offer incentives such as tax reductions to companies or individuals who choose e-taxis for their transportation in order to increase the demand and maximize the positive impact of the taxi fleet electrification. Thank you very much. I am now going to hand over to Cameron.
Thanks, Phoebe. I'll be discussing my project on enabling e-mobility in Africa which was a techno-economic study of battery swap options for electric motorcycle taxis. Now, starting off with the motivation, recently there has been a rapid increase in the use of motorcycle taxis in many African countries, which has led to an increase in local air pollution and emissions. Now, some pilot projects have started looking into electrifying these motorcycles to overcome these issues, but there are various barriers to conventional charging that could hinder their use, such as the required time to charge, regular power outages, and the grids being put under further strain from the additional charging load. Now, this is where battery swapping comes in and is a possible solution. So battery swapping is the relatively quick process where the discharged battery of the motorcycle is swapped out for a fully charged one at a battery swapping station, where stock of additional batteries are kept and charged. However, there is a lack of research for this use case, leaving a number of areas to be explored. So following from this gap in research, two questions were posed for investigation in this thesis. Firstly, what are the key parameters that influence the performance of these battery swapping stations? And secondly, what configurations would be optimal under different scenarios? Two case studies were chosen to focus this research, being Nairobi, Kenya, and Kigali, Rwanda. The research objectives were set to first determine the battery swap demand in these locations, and next, the effect of varying the configuration parameters on the performance of the battery swapping stations needed to be investigated. Finally, performance-related metrics for each configuration needed to be determined for each configuration to be compared. To achieve these objectives, two models were developed. The first model simulated e-motorcycle taxi trips to determine the potential battery swapping demand in these locations, and this information fed into the second model, which simulated the key operational processes of battery swapping stations for various configurations. This battery swapping station model was then rerun for different configurations, such that the resulting performance metrics for each configuration could be compared. The results from these simulations showed that the grid with solar PV scenario was optimal, resulting in the lowest levelized cost of energy while ensuring 100% reliability. The addition of solar PV to the baseline of grid power supply showed many benefits. For instance, in Nairobi, the battery ratio was reduced, and for both cities, the levelized cost of energy was reduced and the emissions reductions were increased. Next, looking at the potential effect on the local distribution network, battery swapping stations were found to increase the evening peak load in both cities, as circled in these 4-day load profiles. A basic charging coordination strategy was then implemented in the model to investigate whether these peak loads could be reduced by shifting the charging of the batteries to off-peak periods. For Nairobi, it can be seen that the strategy has worked, as the loads during the peak periods have effectively shifted away from these peak times. However, in Kigali, the strategy was not effective due to a lower number of batteries available in stock at the station, so more batteries would have been required for charging coordination. The sensitivity of the levelized cost of energy was investigated for CAPEX, OPEX, and lifetime parameters. It was found that the cost and lifetime of lithium-ion batteries, as well as the inflation rates and electricity tariffs in the country, had the largest impact on the levelized cost of energy. So, from these results, I can conclude that solar PV is an important addition to battery swapping stations and should be incentivized to maximize emission reductions. Charging coordination can be used to reduce peak loads, but may require extra batteries, which may increase the levelized cost of energy. So incentives may be required to offset this extra cost. And lastly, the levelized cost of energy is very sensitive to lithium-ion battery costs and electricity tariffs. So policy measures that aim to reduce these costs would have the largest impact on the business case for battery swapping stations. Thanks, that's all for me, and I'll be handing over to Ishu.
Thank you very much, Cam. So this presentation is about mapping the policy landscape with the supply side perspective for electric vehicle adoption in India and to draw comparative pathways with China and the UK. The motivation for this work comes from the fact that recently there has been a lot of talk in India about the EV adoption. This comes primarily from the fact that India is one of the largest producer of GHG emissions. It has got a huge oil import bill, and at the same time, it is grappling with the problem of air pollution in its cities. So, there have been some policy measures which have been announced. However, the uptake of EVs has been very low. This generates curiosity to look for policy barriers and to search for possible remedies. Now, the objectives of this study is to study the policy side ecosystem of India and to map it on the technological innovation systems and to draw the comparative analysis with the ecosystems in China and the UK. Just a brief about technological innovation systems. So a technological innovation system assesses the strength of a system to absorb, nurture, and make an innovation get widely accepted in the market. It focuses on the structural analysis of the system and at the same time looks into the functional dynamics aspect as well. Now, the key issues which were highlighted as we did the India study of the technological innovation system for EV adoption, we find that there are issues pertaining to both structural as well as functional dynamics. On the structural side, we find that there are multiple agencies which are working in the policy formulation process as far as the EVs are concerned, and there is a lack of coordination which is present. Also, India has got a three-tier governance system, and sometimes we find that the jurisdictions are overlapping, and hence the reprioritization of the objectives takes place at different levels of the governance, which weakens the vision. On the functional side, the knowledge development outlook again looks to be weak. We find that the research in India which is taking place is disjoint with the stakeholders not in unison. And also at the same time, the foreign direct investment which is coming in the area of automotive and renewable energy gives a weak outlook. The regulations are key to this transition, and globally the governments are taking this pathway to drive the EV transition. However, an analysis of the NDC regime, the nationally determined cuts regime under the Paris Climate Agreement, we learned that only 10% of the countries have made cuts, they have made commitments for making transport-specific cuts. Of course, India has not made any transport-specific emission cut commitment. Also, on the other side, we find that the exhaust emission norms and the corporate fuel efficiency norms for India, they are also weak and do not incentivize or motivate the manufacturers for an EV adoption. Continuing with the key issues, we learned that the charging infrastructure comes out as one of the biggest barriers for EV adoption in India, and we find that the charging infrastructure planning lacks the system-wide perspective. There is a lack of standards in India which hinders the growth of the domestic industry in this regard so that the cost can be brought down. On the resource mobilization front, we find that there is low capital availability making this transition possible. The Indian banking system is under distress with a lot of non-performing assets or the bad loans. And also the Indian automotive industry is going a historic slowdown, so it does not have the capital to finance this transition. Now, based on the comparative analysis, we have tried to put some recommendations in front of you. On the structural side, India needs to have a centralized coordinating agency, much like on the pattern of the UK OLEV. And the local administrations should be empowered to draw the city-specific plans for EV adoption. The research needs to be consortium-based and participatory and should adopt a tech-agnostic pathway. Regulations are key and they should be benchmarked to the global standards. The charging infrastructure planning should take into account the system-wide perspective and take EVs as tools for grid balancing and ancillary services. On the resources front, India should try to explore the option as taken by India should try to explore the pathway as taken by the China and the UK for floating the green bonds for long-term financing of clean transport-related projects. And also, it needs to overhaul its system of technical and vocational education to prepare the workforce for the EV future. That's all from me. Now my colleague Minen will take us through the greening of the maritime transport presentation. Thank you.
In addition to the road transport discussed above, maritime transport also contributed significantly to the emission. Therefore, my research is about ship, and the topic is ammonia as a low-carbon energy carrier for the marine application. My research purpose is to design an ammonia Kraken class polymer electrolyte membrane fuel cell and propulsion system and a pure hydrogen fuel cell system, and then assess the system's performance for ships at different scales. In order to achieve this aim, firstly, schematic diagram of the system are drawn, and then the mass and energy balance model will be developed and applied on 3 case studies, including the waste yard, water taxi, and cargo ship. Based on the modeling result, the performance of the system will be assessed. Next, I will talk about the basic principle of the hydrogen and ammonia system. For the gaseous hydrogen system, the hydrogen will be fed to the polymer fuel cell first to generate electric power for the ship. The liquid hydrogen works similarly to the gaseous hydrogen system, but the liquid hydrogen is evaporated first by the exact heat from the fuel cell stack before feeding to the stack. The ammonia system is more complicated. The liquid ammonia is first evaporated by the heat recovered from the cracker or the burner, and then will undergo cracking reaction. The cracking reaction is endothermic. Therefore, ammonia and hydrogen burner is used to provide heat to the cracker. The hydrogen from the cracker is purified by the membrane separator before feeding to the fuel cell stack. Moreover, in order to minimize the environmental impact, a static catalytic reactor and an ammonia sorption column are used to remove the nitrogen oxides from the burner and trace ammonia from the cracker. For the result part, the first performance indicator is the volume and the mass. For water taxi case study, the liquid ammonia system has advantage over the gaseous hydrogen system, mainly due to the higher volumetric energy density of the liquid ammonia and lighter fuel tank. For sealing yacht, weight is a more important factor, and hydrogen system can be 9% lighter than the ammonia system, therefore may be preferred. For larger scale cargo ship, the fuel tank volume limit is around 3,400 cubic meters. Therefore, only liquid ammonia and liquid hydrogen can meet the limit. The gaseous hydrogen system cannot due to the bulky hydrogen fuel tank required. Another important factor is environmental impact. Firstly, both of the hydrogen and ammonia system can reach nearly zero emission during operation, and the hydrogen and ammonia system can reduce the life cycle greenhouse gas emission by around 85% to 90%. The last performance indicator is the cost. For the small-scale ship, like water taxi and the yacht, the cumulative cost for the ammonia system and the hydrogen system are around 60% to 80% higher than the fuel system. In contrast, for the larger scale cargo ship, the greenhouse gases and the hydrogen system and the ammonia system will be about 72% to 74% more expensive. In conclusion, the gaseous hydrogen system and ammonia system can both be applied for the small-scale ship, but for the long-distance ocean-going ship, only liquid ammonia and the liquid hydrogen are applicable. And compared with the fuel cell system, the hydrogen system and the ammonia system are more efficient, emit less, more expensive. That's it. Thank you. I will pass to Cam to do the final conclusion.
Thanks very much, Minang. Our team has presented solutions to decarbonize the transport sector through various strategies, technologies, and policies. As we have shown, transport can evolve to become more sustainable through both the private and public sectors, and ideally we need both of these sectors to work together to achieve the rapid transition required. In terms of electric vehicles, many of our findings showed that the charging loads can have a major impact on the electrical grid, and different methods of mitigating these negative impacts were explored and proposed. These solutions included demand-side management, integration of renewable energy sources, and charging coordination. Our research also looked into the framework and policy landscape for EVs, which showed that governments, along with many other stakeholders, need to work collaboratively for the EV transition to occur and can learn from other countries' experiences. This was also found to be especially true for the decarbonization of the maritime transport sector, where it is possible to reach the final aim of zero emissions, but more research is required to make it more technically feasible and cost competitive. We would like to thank you all for taking the time to attend our online seminar on sustainable transport and look forward to answering any questions you may have in the live Q&A session afterwards. Thank you.